It only takes one small mistake to reveal who someone really is. The coffee slipped before she even realized her grip had loosened, a thin stream of dark liquid arcing through the air in slow, unforgiving silence before landing across the front of a perfectly tailored navy suit, the kind that probably cost more than her monthly rent, maybe more than 3 months combined, and for a moment, everything stopped, not metaphorically but physically. Like the entire restaurant had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale, forks frozen halfway to mouths, conversations cut mid-sentence, the soft hum of jazz still playing but suddenly distant, irrelevant, because every eye had shifted to one place, one moment, one mistake, and right in the center of it stood Emily Carter, her hand still slightly raised, fingers trembling just enough to betray the calm expression she forced onto her face, because she had learned long ago that panic only made things worse, that people didn't forgive fear, they punished it, and across from her sat Daniel Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight even in rooms he wasn't in, a man people whispered about in terms of net worth and power and decisions that could erase entire careers with a single email, and now his suit was stained with cheap diner coffee, the contrast almost cruel, dark brown bleeding into pristine fabric, and still, he didn't move, didn't react, didn't even blink at first, just looked at the spreading stain as if calculating something far more complex than a ruined jacket, while Emily finally lowered her hand and reached for the nearest cloth, her voice steady, controlled. "I'm so sorry, sir, let me fix this." The words practiced, automatic, but her eyes, those didn't drop, not fully, not in the way most would expect, because somewhere between double shifts and unpaid bills and years of being overlooked, she had learned a different kind of balance, one where dignity didn't disappear just because something went wrong. And that was the moment the manager noticed, rushing over with urgency, written all over his face, already preparing the apology that would cost her job, already seeing the complaint before it was spoken. "Mr. Whitmore, but the sentence never finished, because Daniel lifted a single hand, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to stop the words in midair, and that alone was enough to silence, not just the manager, but the entire room again, and then, finally, he looked up, not at the stain, not at the cloth in her hand, but directly at her, studying her face with a kind of quiet focus that didn't match the situation, as if the spilled coffee was the least interesting thing that had just happened, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "Are you okay?" And for a second, no one understood the question, not the manager, not the guests, not even Emily, because it didn't fit the script. Everyone had already written in their heads, the one where she apologizes, he reacts, consequences follow. But instead there was this pause, this shift, subtle but undeniable, and Emily felt it. The way the air changed, the way expectation cracked just enough to let something else through, and she straightened slightly, cloth still in hand, meeting his gaze fully now. "I should be asking you that," she said, just as calm, just as steady, and somewhere in the room, someone exhaled, because whatever was about to happen next wasn't going to be what anyone expected. The manager's hand slowly lowered, confusion replacing the urgency that had driven him just seconds ago, because this was not how these moments were supposed to unfold. Not in a place like this where power had clear lines and mistakes had predictable consequences, and yet here they stood, caught in something quieter, something harder to define. As Daniel Whitmore reached for the napkin Emily had offered, but did not immediately use it, instead glancing down at the stain again with a faint, almost imperceptible exhale, as if the ruined fabric meant less to him than the reaction surrounding it, and that alone unsettled the people watching, because they did not know where to place it, did not know how to interpret a man who was not performing the role they had assigned him, while Emily stepped back half a pace, not retreating but giving space, her posture straight, her movements measured, the same way she carried herself through every shift, through every table, through every moment, where someone assumed she was less than what she was, and Daniel noticed the absence of frantic apology, the lack of exaggerated remorse, the way she held herself as if this moment did not define her, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but focused, like he had just found something unexpected in a place he had stopped looking for it. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his tone even, conversational in a way that made the question feel out of place against the backdrop of what had just happened, and Emily hesitated only briefly before answering. Almost 3 years. Her voice steady, unembellished, and that answer carried more than the words themselves. It carried endurance, routine, quiet persistence, things that did not usually interest men like him, and yet he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken, while the manager shifted awkwardly beside them, still unsure whether to intervene or step back entirely, caught between protecting the business and respecting the authority sitting at the table, and finally choosing silence, because silence felt safer, because this interaction had moved beyond policy into something he could not control, and around them, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in hushed tones, glances still lingering but less obvious now, as if people were afraid to disrupt whatever invisible thread had formed between the two, and Daniel finally dabbed at the stain with the napkin, not with urgency, but with calm acceptance, the gesture almost symbolic, as though he understood that some things could not be undone and did not need to be. "It is just coffee," he said, more to the room than to her. But his eyes remained on Emily, measuring, curious, and she gave a small nod, not smiling, not overreacting, simply acknowledging the statement as truth, and that simplicity seemed to interest him even more, because it did not seek approval, did not try to earn forgiveness, it just existed, steady and self-contained, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Whitmore found himself in a situation where he was not the one controlling the tone of the moment, where the balance had shifted in a way so subtle most people would miss it, but he did not, and neither did Emily, even if neither of them said it out loud, because sometimes the most significant changes did not announce themselves, they simply appeared, quiet and undeniable, in the space between two people who refused to play the roles the world expected of them. The moment did not end when the conversation resumed around them. It lingered, stretching quietly through the next few minutes. As Emily moved to her other tables with the same steady rhythm she had always carried, taking orders, refilling glasses, offering polite nods, but something had shifted, not in her movements, but in the way people looked at her now, as if they had just witnessed something they could not quite explain, while behind her, Daniel remained seated, his untouched meal growing less important by the second, his attention drifting not to his phone, not to the conversation he was supposed to be having with his associate across the table, but to the pattern of her movements, the precision, the calm, the absence of hesitation even after what had just happened, and it unsettled him in a way he was not used to, because most people adjusted themselves around him, changed their tone, their posture, their entire presence the moment they recognized who he was, but she had not before, not after, and that difference stayed with him, persistent, undeniable. "You are unusually quiet," his associate finally remarked, setting down his glass with a slight frown, clearly aware that something had shifted in the dynamic of their meeting, and Daniel blinked once, as if returning from a place slightly removed from the room. "Just thinking," he replied, though the words felt insufficient even to him, because what he was doing was not thinking in the way he was used to, not calculating or strategizing, but observing, replaying, questioning, and that was new. While across the room, Emily paused briefly at the service station, her hand resting lightly against the counter as she allowed herself a single breath, controlled, measured, the kind that reset everything without drawing attention, because even though she had appeared calm, the weight of the moment had not been lost on her. She understood exactly what could have happened, exactly how easily things could have gone differently, and yet they had not, and that required its own kind of adjustment, its own quiet processing before she straightened again and returned to the floor, just as composed as before, as if nothing had touched her at all, and when she approached Daniel's table once more, this time with his order, there was no hesitation in her step, no extra caution, just the same professional ease she had shown from the beginning, setting the plate down with care, aligning it precisely, the way she always did, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again, not by accident, not entirely, but with a mutual awareness that acknowledged what had passed between them without needing to name it. "Your steak, medium rare," she said, her tone even, and Daniel gave a slight nod, but did not immediately reach for his utensils. instead watching her for a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for something, or perhaps recognizing that whatever he had expected was not coming, and Emily simply stepped back, ready to leave the table as she would with any other guest, and that was when he spoke again, not louder, not commanding, but clear enough to stop her movement. "Emily," he said, using her name as if testing it, and she paused, turning back with the same composed expression, and in that small, simple exchange, something subtle shifted once more, because names mattered, names changed distance, and Daniel Whitmore, a man who rarely needed to remember them, had chosen to remember hers. She stopped, not abruptly, not with surprise, but with the kind of controlled pause that suggested she had already learned how to handle moments like this, turning back just enough to face him without shifting her posture, without softening her expression, and for a brief second, the distance between them felt different, not measured in feet, but in something less tangible, something shaped by attention rather than status. And Daniel noticed it immediately, the way she did not lean in, did not anticipate what he would say, did not try to fill the silence for him. She simply waited, and that patience unsettled him more than any mistake could have, because he was used to urgency, to people responding before he finished speaking, to conversations bending around his expectations, and yet here, the moment belonged equally to both of them. "Do you always stay this calm?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged with genuine curiosity, and Emily held his gaze for a fraction longer before answering, not rushing, not deflecting. "No," she said simply, and that single word carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could, because it acknowledged something real without offering it up for inspection, and Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if considering that answer, as if recognizing that there was more behind it than she was willing to give, and for the first time, he did not push further, did not press for details, because something in her restraint made him understand that whatever defined her calm was not something she explained to strangers, especially not to men like him, and that realization shifted his approach, subtle but meaningful. "Then why now?" he asked instead, softer this time, and Emily glanced briefly at the table, at the untouched plate, at the faint stains still visible on the fabric despite his earlier attempt to clean it, and then back at him, her voice steady. "As always, because reacting would not change what already happened," she said, and there was no challenge in her tone, no attempt to impress, just a statement of fact, and it landed differently than he expected, not as something small or obvious, but as something precise, something grounded in a kind of clarity he did not often encounter, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the movement slow, thoughtful, as if adjusting to a new perspective he had not planned for, while around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that something far more significant than a spilled drink was unfolding at table 12, and Emily remained where she was for a second longer, not because she needed to, but because the moment had not yet finished, because there was still something unspoken lingering between them, and then she added, almost as an afterthought but with unmistakable intention, "And neither would losing my composure," and that was the point where the balance shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, because she had just named something without naming him, had drawn a line without raising her voice, and Daniel felt it, not as offense, not as resistance, but as recognition, and for a man who had spent years surrounded by people who either agreed with him or avoided him, that kind of clarity was rare enough to hold his attention completely, and for the first time since he walked into the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore was no longer the center of the room. He was simply part of a conversation he did not control, and somehow, that made him listen more carefully than he ever had before. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt deliberate, as if both understood that anything said too quickly would reduce something that had quietly grown between them, and Daniel remained seated, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, no longer reaching for his phone, no longer checking the time, because time had stopped mattering in the way it usually did, replaced instead by a rare sense of presence he did not often allow himself, while Emily stood with the same composed stillness, not shifting her weight, not glancing away, simply waiting in a way that did not feel submissive but intentional, and that distinction was not lost on him. "Most people would have apologized 3 more times by now," he said after a moment, Not accusing, not mocking, just observing. And Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in that without adopting it. Most people think apologies fix perception, she replied, her voice even. They usually just make it easier for others to feel superior, and the words landed with quiet precision, not sharp enough to offend, but clear enough to resonate, and Daniel let out a faint breath that could have been a laugh if it carried more sound. But it did not. It stayed contained, thoughtful, because he recognized himself somewhere in that statement, not directly, but close enough to understand what she meant, and across the table his associate shifted again, now fully aware that the conversation he was part of had changed into something he could not contribute to, something he did not fully understand, and so he remained silent, watching, as if witnessing something he would later try to explain but never quite managed to capture. While Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fully on Emily now, no longer divided. "You are not afraid of losing this job," he said, not as a question but as a conclusion, and Emily's expression did not change. But there was a brief pause before she answered, just long enough to acknowledge the weight of what he had said. "I am aware of the risk," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "But fear does not improve the outcome." And again, it was not defiance, not arrogance, just clarity, the kind that came from experience rather than theory, and Daniel studied her for a second longer, as if confirming something internally, as if adjusting the way he categorized her entirely because she no longer fit into the framework he was used to applying to people in her position, and that realization shifted something in him. Subtle but undeniable. "Sit for a moment," he said then, gesturing lightly to the empty chair across from him, not commanding, not insisting, just offering, and the request hung in the air between them, unexpected in its simplicity, and Emily glanced briefly toward the rest of the dining room, calculating, assessing, the responsibilities still waiting for her, the expectations that did not pause just because one table had changed its tone, and then back at him, her expression steady as always. "I am working," she said, not dismissing him, not yielding either, just stating a boundary without tension, and Daniel nodded once, accepting it without argument, and that acceptance, more than anything else he had done so far, shifted the balance once again, because power that does not insist becomes something else entirely, something quieter, something closer to respect, and Emily turned slightly, ready to return to her other tables, but before she could take a full step away, he spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just enough to reach her. "Then I will wait," he said, and this time there was no immediate response, because the meaning behind those 4 words was not simple, it was not casual, it carried intention, patience, and something even rarer for a man like him, willingness, and Emily felt it, even if she did not turn back right away, even if she simply continued walking, because some things did not need to be answered in the moment to be understood, they just needed to be heard. The rest of the evening unfolded as it always did on the surface. Plates carried, orders taken, receipts printed, the quiet choreography of a restaurant moving forward without pause. But beneath that routine, something had shifted in a way that did not announce itself. It simply stayed, lingering in small glances, in the way conversations lowered when Emily passed by, in the way the manager watched her a little more carefully but said nothing, because nothing had technically gone wrong, and yet everything felt slightly altered. And through it all, Daniel remained at his table long after his associate had finished speaking, long after the original purpose of their meeting had quietly dissolved into something secondary, his attention no longer divided, no longer elsewhere, but anchored in the rhythm of the room, and more specifically, in the presence of one person moving through it with a consistency that did not waver, and true to his word, he waited, not checking his watch, not signaling impatience, simply allowing time to pass in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him outside this space, because waiting had never been part of his habits. It was something he expected from others, not something he offered, and yet here he was, choosing it without announcement, without expectation of recognition. And that choice did not go unnoticed, not by Emily, even if she did not acknowledge it outwardly, because she had seen enough people to understand when something was genuine and when it was performance, and this did not feel like performance. It felt quieter than that, steadier, And when the last of her tables began to clear, when the pace of the room softened just enough to allow a breath between movements, she finally approached his table again, not hurried, not hesitant, just present, the same way she had been from the beginning. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her tone unchanged, professional, even, as if the previous conversation had not carved out something different between them, and Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze with the same level of attention he had held onto since earlier, but this time there was no question behind it, no test, just a quiet certainty. "Yes," he said, and then paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how to say it, something he did not often have to consider, and that pause alone carried more weight than a quick response ever could. "I would like to understand how you see things," he continued, his voice steady, and the request was simple on the surface. But it was not casual. It was not something he would ask just anyone, and Emily recognized that immediately, not as flattery, not as opportunity, but as a shift in intention, and she did not respond right away, not because she was unsure, but because she was deciding whether the question deserved an answer. And that decision, like everything else about her, was not rushed, it was measured, and after a moment, she gave a small nod, not an agreement, not a refusal, just an acknowledgement that the question had been heard. "People usually do not ask that," she said, her voice quiet but clear, and Daniel allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his expression, not out of amusement but out of recognition. "Most people do not want the answer," he replied, and for the first time, there was something in his tone that did not belong to the role he carried outside these walls, something more human, less constructed, and Emily saw it, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that whatever this moment had become, it was no longer about a mistake. It was about something else entirely, something that had started with a spill, but had nothing to do with coffee anymore. Emily did not sit, and she did not rush to answer. She simply remained standing beside the table, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, as if she understood that whatever was happening here did not require movement, only clarity, and Daniel did not repeat the question, did not press, because something in her silence told him that this was not a conversation that followed his usual rules. It would not be negotiated, it would not be accelerated, it would unfold on its own terms, and for once, he allowed that, leaning back slightly in his chair, giving the moment space instead of trying to control it, while around them the restaurant continued its quiet descent toward closing, chairs beginning to empty, voices lowering, the energy shifting from busy to reflective, and in that softer atmosphere, Emily finally spoke, not as a response to impress, not as something rehearsed, but as something simple and exact. "I see patterns," she said, her voice calm. "People repeat themselves more than they think," and Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly, not in challenge, but in interest, because that was not the kind of answer he expected, not from anyone, and especially not from someone in her position, and he nodded once, inviting her to continue without interrupting, without inserting himself into the space she had just opened, and Emily met his gaze briefly before looking past him for a second, as if aligning her thoughts with something beyond the table. "They speak differently when they want something," she continued. "They listen differently when they think someone matters." And then her eyes returned to his, steady, unflinching, and they show who they are most clearly when something goes wrong. And that was the moment the conversation shifted again, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else in the room could point to, but internally, because Daniel understood what she was saying without needing it explained, understood that she was not talking in general terms, she was talking about this moment, about him, about herself, about everything that had unfolded since the coffee hit his suit, and instead of reacting defensively, instead of dismissing it as observation, he let it settle, let it take shape, because it was accurate in a way that was difficult to deny, and accuracy had always been something he respected, even when it was inconvenient. "And what pattern did you see here?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less guarded, and Emily did not hesitate this time, not because the answer was easy, but because it was already decided. "You did not react the way people expected," she said, "and now everyone is trying to understand why," and Daniel's expression remained composed. But there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something that suggested she had reached a point he had not intended to reveal, and for a brief second, he considered deflecting, redirecting, returning to a version of himself that was easier to maintain, but he did not, because something about her presence made that unnecessary, made it feel like a lesser option, and instead, he asked the question that followed naturally, even if it was not one he often asked. "And you," he said, "what did you expect?" And Emily held his gaze, her answer coming without hesitation, without calculation. "I did not expect anything," she said. "That is why I was not surprised." And there was no edge to it, no challenge, just truth. And that truth landed in a way that did not provoke, did not demand, but stayed quiet and undeniable, because for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore realized that the most disarming thing in the room was not power, not status, not wealth, but someone who was not trying to anticipate him at all. Daniel did not respond immediately, and this time the silence was different. Not observational, not curious, but reflective, as if her words had reached somewhere deeper than he had anticipated, and for a man who built his life on anticipation, that alone was enough to hold him still, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, unmoving, his gaze no longer scanning, no longer calculating, just present. And Emily remained where she was, not pressing the moment forward, not retreating from it either, because she understood something that most people did not, that when a person is truly thinking, interruption only breaks what might have mattered, and so she allowed the space to exist, unfilled, unforced, while the restaurant around them moved closer to its quiet end, lights dimming slightly, the soft clink of dishes being cleared, the low murmur of the last few conversations fading into something distant, and in that quieter atmosphere, Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the usual certainty that defined it. "That must make things easier," he said, though the words felt more like a thought than a conclusion, and Emily tilted her head slightly, considering it. "Makes things clearer," she replied, and there was a difference, a subtle but important one, and Daniel caught it, because clarity did not always lead to comfort, and comfort had never been his goal, but clarity, that was something he understood, something he respected, and he gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if aligning that idea with something internal, something unspoken. "And what do you see now?" he asked after a moment, not challenging, not testing, but genuinely asking, and Emily did not look away, did not soften her gaze, because the question deserved the same level of honesty he had allowed into the conversation. "I see someone who is not used to being seen without context," she said, her voice steady, and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight, not heavy enough to burden, but significant enough to remain, and Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested recognition rather than resistance, because she was not entirely wrong, and that realization did not offend him the way it might have before. It intrigued him, in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "And you think that is a problem?" he said, not defensively but curiously, and Emily shook her head once, a small, precise motion. "I think it is a pattern," she replied, and again, she did not label it, did not assign judgment, she simply observed, and that absence of judgment made it harder to dismiss, harder to ignore, because it did not demand agreement, it simply existed as truth, and Daniel looked at her for a long second, longer than was typical, longer than was necessary, and in that moment, something shifted again, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, because for perhaps the first time in years, he was not being evaluated for what he had built, what he controlled, what he represented, but for something else entirely, something quieter, something more human. And he realized that he had been the one asking questions, directing the conversation, shaping the moment, but that was no longer the case. Not completely, because she had changed the direction without force, without intention, simply by being present in a way that did not bend, and that realization stayed with him as he reached for his wallet, not hurriedly, not as an exit, but as a continuation of something already decided, placing it on the table without opening it, without counting anything out, just setting it there as if it were part of the conversation rather than the end of it, and Emily glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, because whatever this moment had become, it was no longer about transactions, and both of them understood that without needing to say it aloud. Daniel did not touch the wallet for a moment, and that hesitation said more than any gesture could have, because it broke a pattern he had followed for years. One where every interaction ended with a number, a signature, a quiet transaction that restored order, but this did not feel like something that needed to be settled. It felt like something that needed to be understood, and Emily recognized that immediately, not from the wallet itself, but from the way he had placed it down without urgency, without expectation, as if even he was unsure what it meant in this moment, and so she did not reach for it, did not acknowledge it beyond a brief glance, because some things lose their meaning when treated too quickly, and this was one of them, and the silence returned again, but this time it was softer, less charged, more resolved, as if both of them had already arrived somewhere they had not planned to go. And Daniel finally leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly against the table, not as a position of control, but of presence. "You are right," he said, his voice quiet but clear, and the words carried weight not because of what they said, but because of who was saying them, because men like him did not often speak in agreement, especially not in ways that required them to reconsider themselves, and Emily did not react with surprise, did not accept it as validation. She simply listened, the same way she had from the beginning, steady, unshaken, and Daniel allowed a faint breath to pass, almost like a release of something he had not realized he was holding. "I am used to context," he continued, choosing his words carefully now. "Titles, expectations, outcomes," and he paused, glancing briefly at the room around them, now nearly empty, before returning his attention to her. "It makes things predictable," and Emily gave a small nod, because she understood that kind of structure, even if she lived outside of it, and he continued, his voice softer still, "But it also makes people invisible." And that was the moment something settled fully between them, not as a realization that belonged to one person, but as something shared, understood without explanation, and Emily's expression did not change, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes, something that said she had known that long before he put it into words, and Daniel reached for the wallet then, finally opening it, not with the intention of closing the moment, but with a kind of clarity that had not been there before, placing cash on the table, more than the bill required, but not in a way that felt excessive, not in a way that demanded reaction, just enough to fulfill the expectation without turning it into something else. And then he closed the wallet and stood, the movement smooth, unhurried, his presence no longer filling the room the way it had when he arrived, because something about him had shifted, not in status, not in power, but in awareness, and he looked at Emily one last time, not searching, not evaluating, just seeing, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added to what had already been said, and then he gave a slight nod, not formal, not distant, but genuine, before turning to leave, and as he walked toward the door, there were no dramatic gestures, no final statements, just the quiet sound of footsteps against polished floor, the soft push of the door opening, and then he was gone, leaving behind a table, a tip, and something far less tangible, and Emily remained where she was for a second longer, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, before she turned back to her work, picking up the check, clearing the table, continuing as she always did. But the room felt different now, not because of who had been there, but because of what had been understood, and somewhere beyond the glass, Daniel Whitmore stepped into the night, carrying something he had not arrived with, not a lesson spoken aloud, not a realization defined by words, but a quiet shift in perspective, the kind that does not demand attention but changes everything, because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not react, not control, not prove anything at all, but simply recognize another person without the weight of expectation, and in that recognition, something rare happens, something that does not need to be repeated to matter. It only needs to be remembered.